The golden light of dawn spreads slowly across the Nile Delta, illuminating papyrus reeds that sway gently in the morning breeze, their feathered tops catching the first rays of Ra's eternal journey across the heavens. Along the riverbank, ibises wade through shallow waters, their reflections rippling in perfect symmetry, while somewhere in the distance, the haunting call of a falcon echoes across the vast expanse of desert that stretches beyond the fertile valley. This is the land where gods walked among mortals, where the boundaries between earth and sky dissolved into myth and memory, and where the feminine divine held dominion over life, death, and the cosmic order that governed all existence. In the beginning, before the great pyramids rose from the desert floor, before the pharaohs carved their names into eternity, there was the goddess, the eternal feminine principle that breathed life into the very foundations of Egyptian civilization. She manifested in countless forms throughout the long millennia of pharaonic rule, her essence flowing like the Nile itself through the religious consciousness of a people who understood that creation, protection, and transformation were fundamentally feminine acts. The ancient Egyptians recognized in their goddesses not merely supernatural beings to be worshipped from afar, but active participants in the daily governance of their world, divine queens whose influence permeated every aspect of royal power and cosmic balance. Isis, perhaps the most beloved of all Egyptian deities, embodied the perfect synthesis of maternal love and sovereign authority, her wings spanning the breadth of the heavens as she gathered the scattered fragments of her husband Osiris and breathed life back into his dismembered form. Her temples stretched from the cataracts of Aswan to the Mediterranean coast, each one a testament to her role as the Great Mother, the protector of the throne, and the source of royal legitimacy. In countless reliefs carved into temple walls, she appears behind the pharaoh, her protective arms outstretched, her presence conferring the divine sanction that transformed mere mortal rulers into living gods. The rustling of her feathers became the whisper of wind through temple corridors, and the tears she shed for her lost husband swelled the annual flood that brought fertility to the land. Hathor, the golden goddess of love and joy, danced through the Egyptian pantheon with the grace of a celestial queen, her cow-eared crown catching starlight as she moved between the realms of earth and sky. Her temple at Dendera stands even now as a monument to feminine divinity, its massive columns topped with her serene face, eyes closed in eternal contemplation, lips curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile that speaks of secrets known only to the gods. Musicians and dancers, mothers and lovers, all found in Hathor their divine patroness, while pharaohs sought her blessing for the stability of their reign and the prosperity of their people. The sound of sistrums shaking in her honor created a celestial music that was said to maintain the harmony of the spheres, each bronze disk catching light like fallen stars as it moved through the sacred rhythms of worship. Neith, the ancient warrior goddess of the Delta, wove the very fabric of existence on her divine loom, her arrows flying swift and true to protect the boundaries of Ma'at, that fundamental principle of truth and cosmic order that held the universe in perfect balance. From her sacred city of Sais, her influence extended throughout the two lands, her red crown marking her as one of the earliest manifestations of royal feminine power. The crocodiles that basked on the muddy banks of delta channels were her sacred animals, their ancient eyes reflecting a wisdom that predated human memory, their powerful forms embodying the protective ferocity that characterized this most primal of goddess queens. In the cool shadows of her temples, priestesses maintained eternal flames that were said to have burned since the first dawn, their light representing the unwavering vigilance with which Neith watched over the created world. Nephthys, the lady of the house, dwelt in the liminal spaces between day and night, between life and death, her dark wings providing shelter for souls in transition as they journeyed through the underworld toward their final judgment. Though often overshadowed by her more famous sister Isis, Nephthys possessed her own distinct power as the protector of the dead and the guardian of sacred mysteries. Her temples were built in quiet places, away from the bustling centers of commerce and politics, where the bereaved could come to seek comfort in her gentle presence. The sound of mourning women echoed through her sacred precincts, their voices rising and falling in ancient lamentations that had been passed down through generations, each note carrying the weight of human sorrow and divine compassion. Mut, the mother goddess whose name means simply mother in the ancient tongue, ruled over the great temple complex at Karnak alongside her divine husband Amun, her vulture crown, marking her as the fierce protector of pharaonic power. Her sacred lake, shaped like a crescent moon, reflected the movement of clouds across the Theban sky, its waters serving as a mirror for celestial events and a source of purification for those who sought her blessing. During the great festivals that marked the turning of seasons, her golden bark would sail across these sacred waters, carried by priests whose chants echoed off the massive pylons that surrounded her domain. The rustle of papyrus scrolls in her temple libraries preserved the wisdom of ages, each hieroglyph a prayer, each text a testament to the enduring power of the feminine divine. Sekhmet, the lioness goddess whose breath was the desert wind and whose roar was the thunder that announced the coming of storms, embodied the terrible aspect of feminine power, the force that could destroy as easily as it could create. Her statues, carved from black granite that gleamed like obsidian in the flickering light of oil lamps, filled the courtyards of Memphis, each one a guardian against chaos, and a reminder that even divine queens possessed claws as well as caresses. The priests who served her performed daily rituals designed to appease her potentially destructive nature, offering wine that ran red as blood down the stone channels carved into her temple floors. Her festivals were times of careful celebration, when the people honored her power while seeking to turn her fierce attention toward their enemies rather than themselves. Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess, whose pregnant belly spoke of abundance and fertility, stood guard over the households of Egypt, her fearsome appearance masking a fundamentally protective nature that embraced mothers and children in its encompassing care. Amulets bearing her image were worn by women throughout the land, small tokens of divine protection that accompanied them through the dangerous passage of childbirth and into the joys of motherhood. Her temples, though smaller than those of the great state goddesses, were filled with offerings of bread and beer, flowers and incense, gifts from grateful mothers who had successfully brought new life into the world under her watchful protection. The gentle lapping of water against the banks of sacred pools created a soothing rhythm that spoke of the eternal cycle of birth, growth, and renewal that she embodied. These divine queens of the Egyptian pantheon established the template for mortal rule, their mythic narratives providing both justification and instruction for the human women who would later claim the pharaoh's crown and the divine authority it represented. In their stories, carved into temple walls and recorded on papyrus scrolls, the ancient Egyptians created a blueprint for feminine sovereignty that would endure for over 3,000 years. The goddesses ruled not through conquest or intimidation, but through wisdom, protection, and the fundamental understanding that true power flowed from harmony with the cosmic order rather than opposition to it. Their examples would inspire and guide the remarkable women who would rise to claim earthly thrones, carrying forward the divine feminine tradition that made Egypt unique among the ancient civilizations of the world. The transition from divine mythology to recorded history remains shrouded in the amber-colored dust of millennia, where the boundary between goddess and queen becomes as fluid as the Nile itself during inundation season. In those earliest dynasties, when the unified kingdom of Egypt was still finding its footing along the fertile banks of the great river, women wielded power in ways that would echo through the corridors of time, their influence rippling outward like concentric circles on still water. Among these shadowy figures of the early dynastic period stands Merneith, whose very name whispers of forgotten authority and maternal strength. The hieroglyphs that spell her identity, beloved of Neith, invoke the ancient goddess of war and weaving, that fierce deity who was said to have emerged from the primordial waters to create the world through her divine craft. Merneith's connection to this powerful goddess speaks to a time when the divine and earthly realms intertwined like threads in a cosmic loom, where queens were seen not merely as consorts, but as living embodiments of divine feminine power. The archaeological evidence for Merneith's reign, emerges from the sacred necropolis of Abydos, that holy site where the earliest pharaohs chose to rest for eternity among the shifting sands. Her tomb complex, designated by modern archaeologists as Tomb Y, stands as testament to a ruler whose power commanded the same respect and resources as her male counterparts. The massive mud brick structure, with its subsidiary burials and elaborate grave goods, speaks of a sovereignty that brooked no question of legitimacy or lesser status. Within these ancient chambers, sealed for over 4,000 years, archaeologists have uncovered wine jars bearing Merneith's name in the formal cartouche reserved for pharaohs, their clay surfaces still bearing the impressions of royal seals pressed into soft mud under the blazing Egyptian sun. These vessels once contained the finest vintages from the Delta region, their contents destined to sustain the queen in her journey through the afterlife. The presence of her name in royal protocols, inscribed with the same reverence accorded to the pharaohs Jer and Den, suggests a ruler who held genuine power rather than merely ceremonial authority. The shadows of other female rulers dance just beyond the reach of historical certainty, their names preserved in fragments of pottery and scattered inscriptions that tantalize modern scholars like mirages in the desert. Queen Nefertiti, whose name also honors the goddess Neith, appears in the historical record as more than a royal consort, her titles suggesting administrative and religious responsibilities that extended far beyond the traditional roles assigned to pharaonic wives. The surviving evidence, though frustratingly incomplete, paints a picture of women who actively participated in the governance of the nascent Egyptian state. These early dynastic queens navigated a world where power was still being defined and codified, where the mechanisms of royal succession remained fluid and adaptable to circumstance. Unlike the rigid protocols that would later characterize pharaonic rule, the first dynasties appear to have embraced a more pragmatic approach to leadership, one that recognized capability and divine favor regardless of gender. The archaeological record suggests that several queens may have ruled as regents for young sons, their authority gradually expanding from temporary stewardship to full pharaonic power. The religious landscape of early dynastic Egypt provided fertile ground for female authority, with goddesses occupying positions of supreme importance in the cosmic order. Isis, though not yet the universal mother goddess she would become in later periods, already commanded reverence as a powerful magical deity whose influence extended over matters of kingship and divine succession. Hathor, the golden goddess of love and music, was simultaneously the fierce eye of Ra, capable of terrible destruction when roused to anger. This duality, nurturing mother and terrible avenger, reflected the complex nature of royal women who could be both gentle rulers and fierce protectors of the realm. The city of Memphis, that great capital founded at the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt, hummed with activity as these early queens held court in palaces whose mud brick walls have long since returned to dust. The administrative machinery of the state, still in its formative stages, required careful nurturing and constant attention to detail. Palace scribes, their reed pens scratching across papyrus scrolls, recorded the daily business of government, grain distributions, tax collections, religious ceremonies, all under the watchful eyes of queens who understood that effective rule required mastery of both grand strategy and mundane detail. The artistic representations that survive from this period, though stylized according to the conventions of Egyptian art, reveal something of the dignity and authority these women commanded. Stone vessels carved with their names, ivory labels that once identified precious goods in royal storerooms, and cylinder seals bearing their titles all speak of rulers who participated fully in the ceremonial and administrative aspects of pharaonic power. The quality of craftsmanship lavished on these objects reflects the high esteem in which these queens were held by the artisans and courtiers who served them. Trade networks that stretched from Nubia to the Levant carried Egyptian goods marked with these queens' authority, spreading awareness of female pharaonic power throughout the ancient Near East. Cedar wood from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and ebony from the heart of Africa all flowed through Egypt under the oversight of rulers who understood that prosperity depended on maintaining these vital commercial connections. The economic records, fragmented though they are, suggest that several early queens took active roles in managing these international relationships. The religious ceremonies that legitimized pharaonic rule took on particular significance when performed by female rulers, connecting them directly to the goddess traditions that had shaped Egyptian spirituality since prehistoric times. The Hatshepsut festival, that ancient ritual of royal renewal, may have taken on different meanings when performed by queens who embodied both human authority and divine feminine power. Temple complexes dedicated to goddesses likely served as centers of political as well as religious authority, their priestesses forming networks of influence that extended throughout the kingdom. Death, that ultimate transition that fascinated Egyptian civilization, appears to have held no terror for these early queens who prepared for eternity with the same thoroughness they brought to earthly rule. The mummification process, already sophisticated in the earliest dynasties, was applied with equal care to royal women, their bodies preserved for the afterlife with the same precious resins and careful wrapping techniques reserved for pharaohs. Golden jewelry, furniture inlaid with precious stones, and ceramic vessels filled with offerings accompanied these queens into their eternal rest. The influence of these early dynastic female rulers extended far beyond their individual reigns, establishing precedents that would echo through Egyptian history like the recurring flood cycles of the Nile. Their examples of effective female leadership provided the foundation upon which later queens like Hatshepsut and Cleopatra would build their own claims to power, demonstrating that divine authority could flow through feminine as well as masculine vessels in the cosmic order that governed Egyptian civilization. The sands of time carried whispers of these early queens forward through the centuries, their lessons in survival and statecraft flowing like the eternal Nile toward a woman who would transform their subtle influence into blazing, undeniable authority. 3 dynasties later, in the gleaming halls of Thebes, a princess named Hatshepsut absorbed the ancient wisdom of feminine power, preparing to shatter every convention that had confined her royal sisters to the shadows. Born into the magnificent 18th dynasty, when Egypt's empire stretched from the cataracts of Nubia to the cedar forests of Lebanon, Hatshepsut emerged into a world where pharaonic power had reached unprecedented heights. The palace corridors echoed with the footsteps of scribes carrying tribute lists from distant lands, while courtiers whispered of the great victories that had filled Egypt's treasuries with gold from the south and silver from the north. Yet beneath this glory lay the same ancient question that had plagued Egyptian succession since the time of the Scorpion Kings. How could divine authority pass through feminine hands without diminishing its sacred power? Thutmose I, Hatshepsut's father, had expanded Egypt's borders through brilliant military campaigns, his chariots thundering across foreign battlefields, while his administrators transformed conquered territories into sources of wealth that would fuel Egyptian greatness for generations. The old pharaoh watched his daughter with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of enemies, recognizing in her quick mind and natural authority the qualities that made rulers legendary. When he spoke of governance during their private moments in the palace gardens, his words carried the weight of hard-won experience. Lessons about the delicate balance between force and diplomacy, between tradition and innovation, between appearing strong enough to command respect while remaining wise enough to listen to counsel. The marriage that bound Hatshepsut to her half-brother Thutmose II followed the ancient customs that kept royal bloodlines pure and concentrated divine essence within the ruling family. Their union represented more than personal alliance. It embodied the cosmic marriage between gods that maintained universal harmony, with each partner playing essential roles in the great drama of Egyptian kingship. When Thutmose II ascended to the throne, Hatshepsut assumed the traditional role of great royal wife, her ceremonial duties including the vital function of serving as the earthly embodiment of goddesses whose favor ensured the kingdom's prosperity. The royal workshops hummed with activity as artisans crafted the regalia and monuments that would proclaim the new pharaoh's legitimacy to both gods and mortals. Master sculptors carved relief scenes showing Thutmose II performing the ritual duties that maintained cosmic order, while painters mixed pigments that would preserve these sacred acts for eternity. Yet in many of these scenes, Hatshepsut appeared not as a passive consort, but as an active participant in the ceremonies, her poses and gestures suggesting a depth of involvement that went beyond mere symbolic presence. Thutmose II's reign unfolded during a period when Egypt's empire required constant attention, rebellions in distant provinces demanding swift military response, while complex diplomatic negotiations maintained peace with neighboring powers. The young pharaoh proved himself capable in these challenges, but his health remained fragile. The same constitutional weakness that had affected other members of his royal line, gradually sapping his strength, despite the best efforts of court physicians, whose medical papyri contained treatments developed over millennia of royal practice. As her husband's vigor declined, Hatshepsut found herself increasingly involved in the administrative machinery that kept the kingdom functioning smoothly. The great bureaucracy that governed Egypt from the Mediterranean to the First Cataract required constant oversight, with reports flowing daily from provincial governors, temple administrators, military commanders, and trade officials, whose collective efforts maintained the complex system that sustained millions of lives. Hatshepsut's natural aptitude for this work became evident as she mastered the intricate details of taxation systems, irrigation management, diplomatic protocols, and religious observances that formed the foundation of Egyptian civilization. The crisis that would reshape Egyptian history arrived with Thutmose II's death after barely 3 years on the throne, leaving behind only a young son by a minor wife, a child whose bloodline carried royal legitimacy, but whose tender age made immediate rule impossible. The regency that followed represented a delicate moment in Egyptian succession, with various court factions maneuvering for influence, while Hatshepsut navigated between her roles as stepmother to the young heir, widow of the deceased pharaoh, and experienced administrator whose knowledge of state affairs surpassed that of any other court member. Initially, Hatshepsut fulfilled the traditional regency role with apparent orthodoxy, appearing in official scenes standing behind the young Thutmose III while he performed ceremonial functions. Her presence providing the continuity and legitimacy that Egyptian kingship required during periods of transition. Temple reliefs from this early period show her in conventional poses, wearing the modest crown of a queen rather than the elaborate regalia of pharaonic authority, her inscriptions emphasizing her devotion to maintaining stability until the rightful king could assume full power. Yet beneath this traditional exterior, Hatshepsut was quietly consolidating support among the powerful institutions that actually governed Egypt. The priesthoods that controlled vast temple complexes and their associated wealth found in her a ruler who understood both the spiritual and economic functions of religious establishments, while provincial administrators appreciated her grasp of the practical challenges they faced in maintaining order across Egypt's diverse regions. Military commanders, initially skeptical of feminine leadership, gradually recognized that her strategic thinking and logistical expertise served their needs better than the inexperience of a child pharaoh, however legitimate his bloodline might be. The transformation that would make Hatshepsut one of history's most remarkable rulers unfolded gradually, each step carefully calculated to maintain the appearance of religious orthodoxy while fundamentally altering the nature of her authority. Royal inscriptions began attributing increasingly important decisions to her direct command, rather than describing her as merely advising the young pharaoh, while artistic representations subtly shifted to emphasize her active role in governing, rather than her passive presence as guardian of royal legitimacy. The theological justification for her unprecedented assumption of full pharaonic authority required brilliant innovation that drew upon Egypt's deepest religious traditions, while adapting them to circumstances no previous ruler had faced. Hatshepsut's scribes crafted narratives that presented her rule not as a break with divine order, but as its perfect fulfillment, emphasizing her direct descent from Thutmose I and suggesting that the gods themselves had chosen her as their earthly representative. These texts wove together conventional phrases with subtle modifications that transformed their meaning, creating a new mythology of feminine pharaonic authority that seemed to emerge naturally from ancient precedents. The physical transformation that accompanied Hatshepsut's assumption of full royal power represented perhaps the most visually striking aspect of her revolutionary reign. As artistic conventions developed over millennia to represent masculine pharaonic authority, adapted to accommodate feminine rule without losing their essential meaning. Early statues showed her in traditional queenly regalia, but gradually these gave way to images that combined feminine features with the symbolic beard, crown, and ceremonial dress that Egyptian artistic tradition required for depicting divine kingship, creating a unique visual language that proclaimed her legitimacy while acknowledging the unprecedented nature of her position. The administrative machinery of Hatshepsut's government reflected her deep understanding of the practical challenges facing Egyptian civilization, in an age when the kingdom's wealth and power had reached heights that required increasingly sophisticated management systems. Her appointments to crucial positions balanced traditional nobles with capable administrators chosen for merit rather than birth, while her economic policies emphasized trade and construction projects that would benefit Egypt long after her death, demonstrating the kind of long-term strategic thinking that distinguished truly great rulers from those who merely occupied thrones. The reign of Hatshepsut had demonstrated that a woman could wield the crook and flail with divine authority, but the kingdom that emerged in the generations following her rule would witness an even more extraordinary transformation of power, beauty, and religious devotion. In the sun-drenched courts of the 18th dynasty, as the new kingdom reached its golden zenith, another queen would rise to prominence, whose very name would become synonymous with eternal beauty and revolutionary change. Nefertiti, whose name means "the beautiful one has come," would not merely occupy the traditional role of royal consort, but would stand as co-regent beside her husband Akhenaten, reshaping the very foundations of Egyptian civilization in ways that would echo through the corridors of history. The world into which Nefertiti emerged was one of unprecedented wealth and artistic flowering, where the treasuries of Thebes overflowed with gold from Nubian mines, and tribute from conquered lands stretched the boundaries of the known world. The royal workshops hummed with activity as master craftsmen perfected new techniques in sculpture and painting, while architects designed temples that reached toward the heavens with unprecedented grandeur. Yet beneath this surface prosperity, the traditional religious establishment had grown powerful beyond measure, its priests controlling vast estates and wielding influence that sometimes rivaled that of the pharaoh himself. Into this complex political and spiritual landscape stepped a young woman whose beauty would be immortalized in limestone and whose influence would challenge the very gods themselves. The surviving portraits of Nefertiti reveal a face of extraordinary refinement and strength, captured by royal artists with a realism that departed dramatically from the stylized conventions of earlier Egyptian art. Her elongated neck rises like a swan's above elegant shoulders, while her cheekbones create shadows that speak of both nobility and determination. The famous painted limestone bust, discovered in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose, shows her wearing the distinctive blue crown that became her signature. Its flat top and ribbon streamers marking her unique status among the royal women of Egypt. The artisans who carved her image worked with unprecedented attention to individual features, creating portraits that seemed to breathe with life and personality, rather than conforming to the idealized templates that had defined royal representation for millennia. When Nefertiti married the young prince, who would become Akhenaten, she entered a court where traditional values were already beginning to shift beneath the weight of new philosophical and religious ideas. Her husband, born Amenhotep IV, had inherited a kingdom where the cult of Amun-Ra dominated religious life from the great temples of Karnak and Luxor, but his own spiritual inclinations drew him toward the worship of a single deity, the Aten, represented as the life-giving disk of the sun. This revolutionary religious vision would transform not only the spiritual landscape of Egypt, but would elevate Nefertiti to a position of power and prominence unlike any queen before her, as she became not merely the pharaoh's consort, but his partner in both earthly rule and divine worship. The decision to abandon Thebes and establish a new capital city dedicated to the Aten marked the beginning of one of history's most fascinating experiments in religious and social revolution. The site chosen for this new city lay on the east bank of the Nile in Middle Egypt, a virgin stretch of desert bounded by cliffs that formed a natural amphitheatre around the river valley. Here, Akhenaten and Nefertiti would create Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, a city designed from the ground up to embody their religious vision and to serve as the stage for their joint rule. The royal couple oversaw every aspect of this monumental undertaking, from the layout of the great temples with their open courtyards designed to welcome the sun's rays, to the residential quarters where nobles and artisans would live in a new kind of community dedicated to the worship of the one true God. Within the walls of Akhetaten, Nefertiti's role transcended all traditional boundaries established for royal women in Egyptian society. The relief sculptures that adorned the temples and palaces of the new city show her participating directly in religious ceremonies, offering incense and libations to the Aten alongside her husband in poses that traditionally belonged to the pharaoh alone. She appears making offerings at the great altar of the Aten, her arms raised in worship as the sun's rays descend like hands to touch her body with their life-giving power. These images reveal a queen who had become not merely a witness to religious transformation, but an active participant in the priestly functions that connected the earthly kingdom to the divine realm above. The artistic revolution that accompanied the religious transformation of Akhetaten produced some of the most beautiful and intimate royal portraiture ever created in ancient Egypt. The workshops of Amarna, as the city came to be known, developed a new artistic style that emphasized naturalism and emotional expression over the formal grandeur of traditional Egyptian art. In these works, Nefertiti and Akhenaten appear not as distant divine figures, but as devoted partners sharing tender moments of family life. Relief sculptures show them playing with their daughters beneath the benevolent rays of the Aten, the royal children depicted with the same careful attention to individual personality that characterized their parents' portraits. The queen nurses an infant while the pharaoh dandles another daughter on his knee, scenes of domestic intimacy that had never before appeared in royal art. The palaces of Akhetaten became showcases for this new artistic vision, their walls decorated with painted reliefs that captured the daily life of the royal court with unprecedented detail and warmth. Gardens bloomed with lotus flowers and papyrus plants, rendered in colors that seemed to glow with inner light, while birds took flight among the branches of trees heavy with fruit. The royal apartments featured ceiling paintings that depicted the night sky, complete with individual stars, creating intimate spaces where the royal family could feel themselves surrounded by the cosmos they ruled. Furniture inlaid with precious stones and ivory reflected the wealth of the empire, while incorporating the flowing, naturalistic designs that had become the signature of Amarna art. The religious ceremonies over which Nefertiti presided represented a complete departure from the mysterious, hidden rituals that had characterized traditional Egyptian worship. Instead of the dark inner sanctuaries where priests had communed with statues of the gods, the temples of the Aten featured vast open courtyards flooded with sunlight, where the royal couple could worship in full view of the people. Nefertiti's participation in these public rituals elevated her to a status approaching that of a co-pharaoh, her presence essential to the proper performance of the religious duties that maintained the cosmic order. She wore crowns and regalia that marked her divine status, appearing in some reliefs with the Uriah serpent on her brow that symbolized royal authority over life and death. The 6 daughters, born to Nefertiti and Akhenaten, grew up in this revolutionary environment, raised as princesses of a new world order where women could wield power with divine sanction. The palace reliefs show them participating in family ceremonies, learning the rituals of Aten worship from their mother, and growing into young women who would carry forward the religious and artistic innovations of Akhetaten. These images of royal daughters engaged in ceremonial activities alongside their parents represented another break with tradition, where royal children had typically remained invisible until reaching adulthood. The princesses of Amarna appeared as individuals with distinct personalities, their childish gestures and natural poses captured by artists who had learned to see beyond the formal requirements of royal representation. The international correspondence discovered in the diplomatic archives of Akhenaten reveals the extent to which Nefertiti's fame had spread beyond the borders of Egypt, her beauty and power becoming legendary among the courts of the ancient Near East. Foreign rulers sent gifts specifically intended for the queen, acknowledging her influence in the governance of the Egyptian empire. These diplomatic letters, written in cuneiform script on clay tablets, provide glimpses into a world where Nefertiti's opinions carried weight in matters of state, and where her approval was sought by ambassadors from distant lands. The queen, who had begun as a consort, had evolved into a figure of international significance, her partnership with Akhenaten creating a new model for shared royal authority. The glory days of Akhenaten would prove relatively brief in the long sweep of Egyptian history, lasting perhaps 17 years before the forces of tradition and political necessity brought about its abandonment. Yet the legacy of Nefertiti's reign would endure far beyond the physical life of the city she had helped create, her image preserved in the masterworks of Amarna art that continued to inspire artists and admirers across the millennia. The revolution she had helped orchestrate represented more than a change in religious practice or artistic style. It embodied a vision of royal partnership and feminine power that would influence the evolution of queenship throughout the ancient world, proving once again that the women of Egypt possessed the strength and wisdom to reshape civilization itself when circumstances allowed their talents to flourish. As the golden sands settled over the ruins of Amarna, and the memory of Nefertiti's revolutionary reign gradually faded into the whispered legends of scribes, the great river continued its eternal journey northward, carrying with it the seeds of new dynasties and fresh alliances that would reshape the very foundations of Egyptian power. The pharaohs who rose in the wake of the Amarna period understood a truth that would echo through the corridors of time. Egypt's strength lay not merely in the granite monuments of its native sons, but in the delicate web of diplomatic marriages that could transform foreign princesses into the beating heart of Egyptian civilization. Among these remarkable women who crossed desert boundaries to claim Egyptian thrones, none wielded influence more profound than Queen Tiye, whose very name would become synonymous with the golden age of the 18th dynasty. Born beyond the traditional borders of the two lands, in the distant kingdom of Nubia, where the great river carved its path through landscapes of startling beauty, Tiye arrived at the Egyptian court as a young woman whose intelligence sparkled like sunlight on the Nile's surface. Her marriage to Amenhotep III was not merely a union of hearts, but a masterpiece of statecraft, binding the wealthy gold-producing regions of the south to the ancient empire through bonds stronger than bronze and more enduring than the pyramids themselves. The palace workshops hummed with unprecedented activity during Tiye's reign. As master craftsmen laboured to create objects worthy of a queen whose influence extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of royal femininity. Goldsmiths shaped gleaming pectorals that bore her cartouche alongside that of her husband, while sculptors carved her likeness in granite and limestone, capturing not just her physical beauty, but the unmistakable aura of authority that seemed to emanate from her very presence. The royal correspondence of the period, preserved on clay tablets in the diplomatic archives, reveals a woman who conducted negotiations with foreign kings as an equal, whose voice carried weight in matters of trade, military strategy, and religious policy. Tiye's apartment within the palace complex became a nexus of international diplomacy, where ambassadors from distant lands gathered to seek audience with a queen whose wisdom had become legendary throughout the ancient world. The walls of these chambers were adorned with paintings that celebrated both Egyptian traditions and Nubian artistic sensibilities, creating a unique visual language that spoke of cultural synthesis rather than conquest. Servants moved through these spaces, carrying vessels of precious oils and rare incense that filled the air with fragrances from across the known world, while musicians played melodies that blended the haunting rhythms of the south with the ceremonial grandeur of Memphis and Thebes. The influence of foreign queens reached its most spectacular expression in the reign of Ramesses II, whose beloved Nefertari embodied the diplomatic marriage as high art, transforming what might have been a mere political arrangement into one of history's most celebrated love stories. Archaeological evidence suggests that Nefertari may have originated from the royal house of a neighboring kingdom, though the precise details of her ancestry remain shrouded in the mystery that seems to cloak so many of ancient Egypt's most fascinating figures. What remains undeniably clear is that her marriage to the great Ramesses created a partnership that would define an era and produce some of the most breathtaking monuments ever created in stone. Nefertari's tomb in the Valley of the Queens stands today as perhaps the most exquisite example of royal burial art ever discovered. Its walls alive with paintings so vivid and detailed that visitors often gasp in wonder at their first glimpse of the Queen's journey through the afterlife. The artists who created these masterpieces worked with pigments ground from precious minerals brought from the far corners of the empire, applying their colors with brushes so fine that individual hieroglyphs seemed to dance with life across the limestone surfaces. Every scene tells a story, not just of death and resurrection, but of a woman whose foreign origins became the source of her strength, whose exotic beauty was matched by a political acumen that helped maintain Egypt's dominance throughout the Mediterranean world. The great temple of Abu Simbel, where Ramesses immortalized himself in 4 colossal statues carved from the living rock, also bears testament to Nefertari's extraordinary position within the royal hierarchy. Unlike the wives of previous pharaohs, who were typically represented in diminutive scale beside their husbands, Nefertari appears in the smaller temple nearby at nearly equal size to the king himself. Her elegant figure, striding forward with the confident grace of a woman who knew herself to be the co-ruler of the greatest empire on earth. The hieroglyphic inscriptions that accompany these images speak of her as the one for whom the sun shines, suggesting that her foreign origins were not seen as a limitation, but as a source of exotic power that enhanced rather than diminished the pharaoh's divine authority. The practice of diplomatic marriage reached perhaps its most complex expression during the later periods of Egyptian history, when pharaohs routinely maintained correspondence with dozens of foreign courts, negotiating marriage alliances that created a vast network of international relationships. The royal harems of this period were not merely collections of beautiful women, but sophisticated diplomatic institutions where princesses from across the ancient world lived together, their presence serving as living guarantees of peace treaties and trade agreements that kept goods and ideas flowing along the great commercial routes that connected Egypt to the wider world. These foreign queens brought with them more than political advantages. They carried in their personal possessions and cultural practices the seeds of artistic and intellectual innovations that would enrich Egyptian civilization in ways both subtle and profound. The jewelry discovered in royal tombs from this period shows clear influences from Mesopotamian, Anatolian, and African artistic traditions, while religious texts reveal the gradual incorporation of foreign deities and ceremonial practices into the complex pantheon that governed Egyptian spiritual life. Palace kitchens experimented with new spices and cooking methods introduced by foreign queens and their retinues, while royal workshops adapted techniques for metalworking, textile production, and perfume making that originated in distant lands. The letters preserved in the diplomatic archives reveal the human dimension of these international marriages, showing foreign queens maintaining correspondence with their birth families while simultaneously establishing themselves as devoted mothers to their Egyptian children and loyal wives to their pharaoh husbands. These women navigated the complex protocols of court life with remarkable skill, learning to speak and write hieroglyphic Egyptian while preserving aspects of their native cultures that enriched the cosmopolitan atmosphere of the royal court. Their children, raised at the intersection of multiple cultural traditions, often became some of Egypt's most innovative rulers and most capable diplomats. As evening shadows lengthened across the palace courtyards, and the last light of Ra's boat disappeared beyond the western horizon, these foreign queens would retire to chambers where the luxury of empire surrounded them like silk and gold. Their sleeping apartments were furnished with beds inlaid with ivory and precious woods, draped with linens so fine they seemed woven from moonbeams, while servants burned incense that filled the night air with fragrances that spoke of homes they had left behind and new worlds they had helped to create. In their dreams, perhaps, they walked through landscapes that blended the familiar geography of their birth with the mysterious beauty of the land that had become their eternal resting place, their spirits forever woven into the golden tapestry of Egyptian immortality. The legacy of these foreign queens extends far beyond their individual stories, representing a fundamental truth about the nature of ancient Egyptian civilization that challenges simple narratives of isolation and xenophobia. Through their marriages, their diplomatic skills, and their cultural contributions, women like Ti and Nefertari demonstrated that Egypt's greatness lay not in its ability to remain unchanged, but in its capacity to absorb and transform influences from across the known world, creating a synthesis that was both distinctly Egyptian and genuinely international in its scope and vision. The shadows of empire lengthened across the Mediterranean world as the 3rd century before the Common Era drew to its close, and in Alexandria, the great lighthouse cast its beacon across waters that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless dynasties. The Ptolemaic kingdom that had emerged from the fragments of Alexander's empire now found itself caught between the grinding millstones of Roman ambition and its own internal decay, while the ancient traditions of pharaonic Egypt flickered like oil lamps in the gathering dusk. Into this world of fading grandeur and gathering storm clouds came a woman whose very name would echo through the corridors of history long after the last hieroglyphs had been carved into temple walls. Cleopatra VII Philopator ascended to the throne of Egypt in 51 BCE, inheriting not the golden prosperity that had once flowed like the Nile's annual flood, but a kingdom battered by civil wars, weakened by Roman interference, and divided against itself. The blood of Macedonian generals flowed in her veins, yet she was the first of her dynasty to master the ancient tongue of Egypt, speaking fluently the language that had been old when the pyramids were new. Her voice carried the authority of pharaohs who had ruled when Rome was merely a collection of mud huts beside the Tiber. Yet her reign would unfold against the backdrop of that same Rome's inexorable expansion across the known world. The palace corridors of Alexandria whispered with the same intrigues that had plagued the Ptolemaic court for 3 centuries, but now the stakes had grown impossibly high. Cleopatra's younger brother Ptolemy XIII, following the traditions of their house, became both her co-ruler and her rival, supported by the powerful eunuchs and advisors who saw in his youth a puppet they could manipulate. The Great Library of Alexandria, repository of human knowledge gathered from across the ancient world, bore witness to councils of war where the fate of the last independent Hellenistic kingdom hung in the balance, like incense smoke in the still air of temple sanctuaries. The Mediterranean winds that had once carried merchant ships heavy with Egyptian grain to grateful Greek cities now brought Roman warships to Alexandria's harbour, their bronze rams cutting through waters that reflected the setting sun like molten copper. Julius Caesar arrived not as a conqueror, but as a power broker, seeking to resolve the civil war that threatened to tear Egypt apart. Yet his presence marked the beginning of the end for pharaonic independence. The famous encounter between Caesar and Cleopatra, smuggled into his presence wrapped in carpets and silks, became the stuff of legend. But beneath the romantic flourishes lay the cold calculation of a queen who understood that Egypt's survival depended upon aligning itself with Rome's rising star. The palace chambers, where Caesar and Cleopatra conducted their diplomatic dance, were hung with tapestries that depicted the glorious campaigns of earlier pharaohs, their golden threads catching the light of oil lamps that burned with the same steady flame that had illuminated the workshops of ancient craftsmen. Their relationship transcended mere political alliance, producing a son whose mixed heritage embodied both the twilight of one world and the dawn of another. Caesarion, as the child came to be known, carried within his veins the blood of Roman dictators and Macedonian kings, Egyptian pharaohs and Mediterranean merchants, a living symbol of the cultural synthesis that had defined Alexandria for 3 centuries. The assassination of Caesar on the Ides of March sent shockwaves across the Roman world that reached Alexandria like ripples from a stone cast into still water. Cleopatra, who had witnessed firsthand the brutal pragmatism of Roman politics, found herself once again navigating the treacherous currents of imperial rivalry as Caesar's successors carved up his legacy like priests dividing sacrificial offerings. The triumvirate that emerged from the chaos brought new players to the Mediterranean stage, and among them strode Mark Antony, whose appetite for pleasure and power would become inextricably entwined with Egypt's final chapter. The meeting between Cleopatra and Antony at Tarsus became a theatrical masterpiece that demonstrated the Queen's profound understanding of spectacle and symbolism. Her barge, dressed as if for the goddess Aphrodite herself, sailed up the Cydnus River with purple sails billowing in the Mediterranean breeze, while the scent of rare incenses drifted across the water like the breath of ancient gods. The golden stern caught the sunlight that filtered through silk canopies, and the rhythmic splash of silver oars kept time like the heartbeat of empire itself. This was statecraft as performance art, a deliberate evocation of divine authority that reminded all who witnessed it that the woman aboard claimed descent from both Alexander the Great and the gods themselves. Their alliance bloomed like lotus flowers in the sacred pools of Egyptian temples, a union that combined genuine affection with ruthless political calculation. Antony found in Cleopatra not merely a lover, but an equal in ambition and intelligence, a partner who could match his grand gestures with displays of magnificence that drew upon 3 millennia of pharaonic tradition. Together, they created a court that rivaled the greatest centers of power in the ancient world, where Greek philosophers debated with Egyptian priests, while Roman engineers planned grand building projects that would outlast their creators. The donations of Alexandria, where Antony formally granted vast territories to Cleopatra and her children, marked the high tide of their shared ambitions. In ceremonies that echoed the ancient traditions of pharaonic coronation, they distributed kingdoms like wedding gifts, while crowds of Alexandrians watched from streets lined with columns that had stood since the city's founding. The golden thrones upon which they sat reflected light that had travelled across deserts and seas to illuminate this moment of supreme confidence, yet already the shadows were lengthening as Octavian marshalled his forces for the confrontation that would determine the fate of the Mediterranean world. The Battle of Actium unfolded across waters that had known the passage of Phoenician traders and Greek colonists, Egyptian grain ships and Roman triremes, but none had carried such momentous consequences as the vessels that clashed in 31 BCE. Cleopatra's fleet, decorated with the emblems of pharaonic power that had commanded respect when Rome was young, fought alongside Antony's Roman ships in a battle that would decide whether the ancient world would bow to a single master or continue to embrace the cultural diversity that had flourished since Alexander's conquests. The defeat that followed was as complete as it was decisive, sending the last pharaoh of Egypt fleeing across the Mediterranean toward a kingdom that would soon cease to exist. The final act of this ancient drama played out in Alexandria, where Cleopatra had transformed sections of the palace complex into a mausoleum worthy of her illustrious predecessors. The rooms, where she chose to spend her last days, were filled with treasures that represented the accumulated wealth of pharaonic Egypt. Golden jewelry that had adorned queens for thousands of years, precious stones that had been old when the first dynasty unified the two lands, and scrolls containing knowledge that would soon be scattered to the winds of conquest. The asp that ended her life was chosen with the same careful attention to symbolism that had characterized her entire reign, for serpents had long been associated with pharaonic power and divine protection. Octavian's arrival in Alexandria marked not merely the end of a dynasty, but the close of an entire epoch in human history. The treasures of Egypt that filled Roman ships bound for Italy represented more than mere wealth. They embodied the accumulated wisdom and artistic achievement of a civilization that had flourished beside the Nile when most of the world remained locked in barbarian darkness. The Great Library continued to function under Roman rule, but the spirit that had made Alexandria the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world had departed with its last pharaoh. The legacy of Cleopatra VII extended far beyond the political calculations that had defined her reign, encompassing a vision of female power that drew upon the deepest traditions of Egyptian queenship, while adapting to the realities of a Mediterranean world increasingly dominated by Roman might. Her death marked the end of pharaonic independence, but her memory preserved something essential about the civilization that had created the pyramids and temples, the mathematical principles and astronomical observations that had guided human understanding for millennia. In the silence that followed her passing, the ancient gods of Egypt began their long retreat into mythology, leaving behind monuments that would outlast the empire that conquered them. As Cleopatra's golden barge disappeared beneath the Mediterranean waves, and the Roman eagles cast their shadows across the Nile Delta, the ancient traditions that had sustained Egyptian civilization for over 3 millennia began their slow fade into memory. Yet even as political power shifted to foreign hands, the sacred roles that had elevated royal women to positions of divine authority continued to echo through the temple halls, their rituals and ceremonies carrying forward the mystical connection between mortal queens and immortal goddesses that had defined Egyptian spirituality since the First Dynasty united the two lands. The sacred landscape of ancient Egypt had always been as much a feminine domain as a masculine one, with royal women serving not merely as political figures, but as living bridges between the earthly realm and the divine cosmos that governed all existence. In the shadowed sanctuaries of Karnak and Dendera, Edfu and Philae, these women moved through ceremonies that transformed them from mortal flesh into divine vessels, their every gesture and utterance carrying the weight of cosmic order itself. The role of high priestess represented perhaps the most profound spiritual authority available to any individual in Egyptian society, man or woman, for these sacred offices connected their holders directly to the Neteru, the divine forces that animated the universe. Among the most exalted of these positions stood the office of God's wife of Amun, a title that carried such immense spiritual and temporal power that it often rivaled the authority of the pharaoh himself. This sacred role, which reached its zenith during the New Kingdom period, transformed its holder into the earthly consort of Amun-Ra, the king of the gods whose temple complex at Karnak dominated the religious landscape of Thebes. The god's wife was no mere ceremonial figure, but wielded genuine authority over vast temple estates, controlled enormous wealth, and commanded the loyalty of thousands of priests, scribes, and temple workers whose lives revolved around serving the god through her divine personage. The selection and consecration of a god's wife involved elaborate rituals that began in early childhood and continued throughout the woman's lifetime, creating a spiritual transformation so complete that she became, in the eyes of both priests and people, a living goddess walking among mortals. These women, often daughters or sisters of reigning pharaohs, underwent years of sacred instruction in the hidden mysteries of Amun's cult, learning the precise intonations of ancient hymns, the complex choreography of temple ceremonies, and the esoteric knowledge that allowed them to commune directly with divine forces. Their days unfolded in rhythmic cycles of prayer and ritual, their voices rising in the pre-dawn darkness to greet the sun god's daily rebirth, their hands offering sacred bread and beer to golden statues whose eyes were believed to hold the actual presence of the deity. Within the massive stone walls of Karnak, where columns thick as ancient trees supported roofs that seemed to hold up the very sky, the god's wife maintained apartments that rivaled any royal palace in their luxury and spiritual significance. Golden furniture inlaid with lapis lazuli and electrum furnished rooms where sacred texts written on papyrus and carved into stone walls revealed the deepest secrets of creation itself. Gardens bloomed within the temple precincts, their lotus pools reflecting starlight, while sacred ibises waded through waters that symbolized the primordial ocean from which all life had emerged. The god's wife moved through these spaces, attended by female servants who had themselves taken vows of purity, their white linen garments rustling softly as they carried silver censers burning with frankincense and myrrh, imported from the distant lands of Punt and Nubia. The spiritual authority of these sacred women extended far beyond the temple walls, reaching into every aspect of Egyptian religious life, through a network of priestesses and temple musicians who served under their direction. In temples throughout Egypt, women held positions of profound religious significance as chanters, dancers, and ritualists, whose performances were believed to maintain the cosmic harmony that kept the Nile flowing, the sun rising, and the forces of chaos at bay. These priestesses, many of whom came from the highest ranks of Egyptian society, underwent their own initiation ceremonies that involved symbolic death and rebirth, emerging from sacred chambers with new names and identities that marked their transformation from ordinary mortals into servants of the divine. The daily life of a high priestess unfolded according to ancient patterns that connected her every action to the great cosmic cycles governing existence itself. Before dawn, she would rise to participate in the opening of the mouth ceremony that awakened the temple's primary deity, her voice joining with those of other sacred women in chants so old their origins had been forgotten even in pharaonic times. Throughout the day, she would oversee the presentation of offerings, the maintenance of sacred flames, and the performance of rituals designed to ensure the continued favor of the gods toward Egypt and its people. Her evening prayers, offered as shadows lengthened across courtyards filled with the scent of burning incense, carried the petitions and gratitude of an entire civilization to the divine realm, where deceased pharaohs sat in judgment and the gods deliberated the fate of mortals. Perhaps no aspect of these women's sacred roles proved more mysterious or powerful than their function as intermediaries between the living and the dead, conducting rituals that allowed communication across the boundary, separating the earthly world from the realm of the ancestors. In darkened burial chambers beneath temple complexes, high priestesses performed ceremonies involving sacred texts from the Book of the Dead, their words guiding deceased souls through the perilous journey to the afterlife, while their prayers ensured the continued protection of the living from malevolent spirits that might seek to disrupt the cosmic order. These women possessed knowledge of spells and incantations so potent that they were written only in hieroglyphs that required years of study to decipher, their meanings passed down through generations of initiates who guarded these secrets as carefully as pharaohs protected their royal tombs. The temples themselves served as centers of learning where priestesses studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature, their intellectual pursuits supported by vast libraries containing papyrus scrolls that preserved the accumulated wisdom of millennia. These sacred women often became renowned as healers and oracles, their reputation for wisdom drawing pilgrims from across the Mediterranean world who sought their counsel on matters ranging from personal relationships to affairs of state. Their knowledge of herbal remedies, surgical techniques, and spiritual healing practices made them indispensable to Egyptian society, while their ability to interpret dreams and divine the will of the gods through various forms of divination established them as crucial advisors to pharaohs and commoners alike. The economic power wielded by these religious institutions under feminine leadership proved equally impressive, with major temples controlling agricultural estates that stretched for miles along the Nile's fertile banks, workshops that produced luxury goods traded throughout the ancient world, and treasuries filled with gold, silver, and precious stones that represented wealth beyond the imagination of most mortals. The god's wife of Ammon, in particular, commanded resources that allowed her to fund massive construction projects, support thousands of dependents, and maintain diplomatic relations with foreign powers through the exchange of costly gifts and the arrangement of ceremonial marriages. This temporal authority, combined with her spiritual role as the god's earthly consort, made her one of the most powerful individuals in all of Egypt. Her influence extending into every corner of the kingdom through networks of priests, administrators, and devotees who looked to her for guidance and protection. As centuries passed and Egypt's political landscape shifted under the pressure of foreign invasions and internal strife, these sacred roles adapted and evolved while maintaining their essential connection to the divine forces that Egyptians believed governed all existence. Even as Greek and Roman influences gradually transformed Egyptian culture, the temples remained bastions of traditional religious practice, where royal women continued to serve as high priestesses and gods' wives, their ancient ceremonies providing spiritual continuity amid the turbulence of political change. The echoes of their voices, raised in praise of gods whose names would eventually be forgotten by most of the world, continued to resonate through stone halls, where shadows danced in the flickering light of oil lamps, and the eternal rhythms of ritual and prayer maintained their connection to mysteries that transcended the rise and fall of earthly dynasties. The sacred responsibilities of royal women extended far beyond the temple walls and into the most precarious moments of Egyptian political life. When the death of a pharaoh left behind a child too young to wield the full weight of divine kingship. In these delicate transitions, queens emerged from their ceremonial roles as gods' wives and high priestesses to assume the complex burden of regency, becoming the steady hands that guided the kingdom through its most vulnerable periods. The ancient scribes recorded these moments with particular care, understanding that the stability of Ma'at itself hung in the balance when a woman stepped forward to rule in the name of a boy king, her authority drawn from bloodlines both mortal and divine. The palace corridors echoed differently during these times of transition, filled with the whispered consultations of court officials and the measured footsteps of queens who had transformed overnight from consorts into sovereigns. These women faced a challenge unlike any other in the ancient world, for they had to project absolute authority while maintaining the fiction that their power was temporary, held only until their young charges came of age. The delicate choreography of regency required them to be simultaneously visible and invisible, commanding enough to maintain order, yet careful never to appear to threaten the eventual rule of their sons or stepsons. Ankhesenamon's letters to the Hittite king reveal the desperate isolation that could engulf a queen when political circumstances shifted beyond her control. But her predecessors had established pathways through which female regents could navigate the treacherous waters of court politics. Queen Ahhotep I, whose mummy bore the scars of battle wounds, ruled as regent for her son Ahmose I during the final campaigns against the Hyksos invaders, her golden flies of valor testimony to a reign that saw Egypt's reunification through both diplomatic cunning and military prowess. The temple reliefs show her receiving tribute from foreign dignitaries, her figure carved with the same ceremonial grandeur accorded to any pharaoh, yet always positioned in ways that acknowledged her role as keeper of the throne rather than its permanent occupant. The regency of Hatshepsut for her stepson Thutmose III began with similar careful positioning. The queen regent depicted in traditional feminine garb as she performed the rituals necessary to legitimize the young king's rule. The surviving correspondence from this period shows how she navigated the complex relationships with provincial governors and foreign allies, maintaining Egypt's international standing while domestic factions weighed the unprecedented situation of extended female rule. The gradual transformation of her iconography from queen regent to pharaoh tells a story of political evolution that unfolded over years, each subtle change in her royal cartouche and ceremonial dress marking another step toward full pharaonic authority. Royal tutors and high priests played crucial roles in these delicate balances of power, their loyalty often determining whether a regency would proceed smoothly or dissolve into factional conflict. The preserved teaching texts from the Middle Kingdom reveal how these advisors were trained to support female regents while preparing young kings for eventual rule. Their instruction carefully balanced to prevent either the eclipse of the regent's immediate authority or the diminishment of the heir's future prospects. The tomb paintings of these court officials show them in positions of respect toward queen regents, their poses and placement indicating the formal protocols that had evolved to accommodate female rule within the traditional structures of pharaonic power. The economic records from periods of regency illuminate another dimension of female authority, as queen regents took control of Egypt's vast administrative machinery with its complex systems of taxation, trade, and resource distribution. Papyrus documents from the reign of Queen Nefertiti show her personal seal on grain distribution orders and mining expedition authorizations, her authority extending into every aspect of kingdom management that had once been the exclusive domain of male pharaohs. The precision of these records suggests that female regents were not merely ceremonial figureheads, but active administrators who understood the intricate workings of Egyptian governance. Foreign correspondence during regencies often reflected the uncertainty that neighboring kingdoms felt when dealing with female rulers. Their diplomatic language carefully crafted to acknowledge Egyptian power while testing the limits of a regent's authority. The Amarna letters include several exchanges where foreign rulers addressed queen regents with elaborate respect, while subtly probing for signs of weakness or instability. Their own political calculations, influenced by the unprecedented nature of female rule in their regional power dynamics. These diplomatic dance steps required extraordinary skill from the Egyptian queens, who had to project strength across cultural boundaries that often had no precedent for recognizing female authority. The religious establishment played a particularly complex role during royal regencies, as the priests of Amun and other major deities had to balance their traditional support for pharaonic authority with the unusual circumstances of female rule. The temple inscriptions from these periods often emphasize the divine selection of queen regents, their texts carefully constructed to present female rule as the will of the gods rather than a political expedient. The ceremonial calendars show how religious festivals were adapted to accommodate queen regents, their participation in sacred rituals modified to maintain religious authenticity while acknowledging their temporary but absolute authority. Military commanders faced perhaps the greatest challenges in accepting female regents, as their warrior culture often struggled to reconcile traditional concepts of martial leadership with the reality of queens who commanded Egypt's armies. The preserved military correspondence from Queen Ahhotep's regency shows how she addressed this challenge through a combination of personal presence on campaign and careful delegation to trusted generals. Her authority reinforced through successful military outcomes rather than challenged through extended absence from the battlefield. The victory inscriptions from her campaigns emphasized divine support for her leadership. Their language, carefully chosen to present military success as confirmation of her legitimate authority. The transition from regency back to male rule represented another delicate negotiation, as queen regents had to gradually withdraw from positions of authority while ensuring the smooth transfer of power to their young charges. The archaeological evidence suggests that this process varied considerably depending on the personalities involved and the political circumstances of each transition. Some regents stepping back gracefully, while others, like Hatshepsut, chose to retain pharaonic authority for extended periods. The surviving artwork from these transitions often shows both regent and young king in ceremonial scenes, their relative positions and symbolic attributes carefully calibrated to reflect the evolving balance of authority. Provincial governors and local officials throughout Egypt watched these regencies with particular attention, as their own positions often depended on correctly interpreting the shifting dynamics of central authority. The administrative records from Upper Egyptian provinces show how local officials adapted their correspondence and tax collections to acknowledge queen regents while positioning themselves advantageously for eventual transitions to adult male rule. The tomb inscriptions of these officials reveal the careful language they employed to honor female regents, without committing themselves so completely that they would face difficulties when power structures inevitably shifted. The legacy of these royal regencies extended far beyond their immediate political impacts, as they established precedents for female authority that would influence Egyptian governance for centuries to come. Their success or failure shaping cultural attitudes toward women in positions of power, and creating templates for future queens who might face similar circumstances in their own reigns. The transition from regent to memory, from living authority to eternal monument, marked one of the most profound transformations in the ancient world. When the great queens of Egypt passed from temporal power into the realm of the gods, their stories did not end with the closing of tomb doors or the final ritual offerings. Instead, their legacy began its most enduring chapter, carved into the very bones of the earth and crafted from the most precious metals the Nile Valley could offer. Stone became their eternal voice, speaking across millennia in hieroglyphs that danced along temple walls and tomb chambers. The limestone quarries of Tura surrendered their finest blocks for monuments that would bear the names and deeds of these remarkable women, while the granite of Aswan provided the enduring canvas for their most magnificent portraits. Artists and craftsmen, working under the blazing Egyptian sun, transformed raw rock into testimonies of feminine power that would outlast empires and weather the storms of centuries. Each chisel strike was deliberate, each carved symbol a declaration that these women had wielded authority equal to any pharaoh who had ever ruled the two lands. In the workshops of Memphis and Thebes, master sculptors labored over statues that would capture not merely the physical likeness of these queens, but the essence of their power. The workshop of the royal sculptor rang with the sound of copper chisels against stone, as artisans guided by divine inspiration and royal commission created portraits that transcended mere representation. These were not simply decorative objects or commemorative pieces, but rather manifestations of divine authority, frozen in eternal form. The sculptors understood that they were not merely crafting images, but creating vessels through which the Ka, the spiritual essence of these powerful women, could continue to influence the world of the living. The artistic conventions that governed royal portraiture underwent subtle but significant transformations when depicting these queens and female pharaohs. Traditional masculine symbols of pharaonic authority were adapted and reimagined, creating a visual language that could express feminine power without diminishing its impact. The false beard of divine kingship, when worn by Hatshepsut, became not an awkward masculine affectation, but a sacred symbol transformed by feminine interpretation. Crown and scepter, uraeus and crook, all the traditional regalia of pharaonic authority, were rendered in ways that acknowledged the unique nature of feminine rule, while maintaining the essential divine character of Egyptian kingship. Gold, that flesh of the gods that never tarnished or decayed, became the medium through which the most intimate expressions of these women's power were preserved. In the royal workshops, master goldsmiths worked with metals so pure, they seemed to capture and hold the light of Ra himself. Jewelry was not mere adornment in ancient Egypt, but rather a complex system of magical and political communication, each piece carefully designed to convey specific messages about the wearer's status, power, and divine connections. The golden pectorals of queens displayed intricate scenes of their protection of Egypt, while their crowns incorporated symbols that linked them directly to the most powerful goddesses of the Egyptian pantheon. The wall paintings that adorned royal tombs and temples created narrative cycles that celebrated these women's achievements in the most enduring medium known to ancient artists. Pigments ground from precious minerals and mixed with binding agents that had preserved their brilliance for thousands of years told stories of military victories, religious ceremonies, and divine interactions. These painted chronicles were not mere decorations, but rather sacred texts written in the language of image and symbol, designed to ensure that the accomplishments of these remarkable women would continue to resonate in both the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Temple reliefs carved during the reigns of powerful queens show them performing the most sacred duties of pharaonic office, their images placed alongside those of gods and receiving the same divine honors traditionally reserved for male rulers. At Karnak, Dale Bahari, and Abu Simbel, the stone walls themselves became chronicles of feminine power, recording for eternity the religious ceremonies, military campaigns, and diplomatic triumphs of women who had successfully claimed and wielded pharaonic authority. These reliefs were not created as historical documents in the modern sense, but rather as magical texts that would ensure the continued effectiveness of these rulers' authority even after their earthly reigns had ended. The artistic programs commissioned by these powerful women extended far beyond personal glorification to encompass broader themes of cosmic order and divine harmony. Their monuments celebrated the fundamental Egyptian concept of Ma'at, the divine balance that kept the universe functioning properly, presenting their rule as essential to maintaining this cosmic equilibrium. Temple complexes rose from the desert floor as manifestations of their understanding that true power lay not in domination, but in harmony with the eternal principles that governed both earth and sky. Portrait statuary of these queens reveals an artistic sophistication that went beyond conventional royal representation to explore the unique challenges and triumphs of feminine rule. The subtle modeling of facial features, the careful attention to costume and regalia, and the sophisticated use of symbolic elements all combined to create images that were both unmistakably feminine and undeniably powerful. These statues were designed to serve as eternal intermediaries between the divine and human realms, channels through which the queen's protective influence could continue to benefit Egypt long after their mortal forms had returned to dust. The materials chosen for these artistic legacies were themselves statements of power and permanence. Quartzite from the Red Mountains, basalt from the desert quarries, and the finest limestone from Tura were selected not merely for their beauty, but for their ability to endure. The ancient Egyptians understood that artistic legacy was meaningless if the medium could not survive the ravages of time, and they chose materials that could preserve their messages across millennia. Each stone was carefully selected, each surface meticulously prepared to receive the images and inscriptions that would carry these women's stories into eternity. The collaborative nature of royal artistic projects reveals the sophisticated administrative systems that supported these women's reigns. Master craftsmen, scribes, architects, and labourers all worked together under royal patronage to create monuments that reflected not just individual achievement, but the collective prosperity and stability that feminine rule could bring to the kingdom. These artistic endeavours were themselves expressions of political power, demonstrating the Queen's ability to marshal resources, coordinate complex projects, and create lasting benefits for their subjects. The temples, tombs, and monuments that rose under their patronage stood as permanent testimonies to the effectiveness of their leadership and the prosperity their reigns had brought to the two lands. The sands of time have settled over the tombs and temples where Egypt's mighty queens once walked, yet their presence lingers in ways both tangible and mysterious. Deep beneath the limestone cliffs of the Valley of the Queens, their mummified forms rest in chambers carved from living rock, surrounded by treasures meant to accompany them on their eternal journey. The walls surrounding these sacred resting places shimmer with scenes painted in blues as deep as the Nile at twilight and golds that catch the faintest torchlight, depicting their transformation into goddesses worthy of sailing alongside Ra through the endless cycles of death and rebirth. Within these hallowed chambers, the queens continue their reign in realms beyond mortal comprehension. Nefertari's tomb speaks in hieroglyphic poetry across its walls, every symbol a prayer, every painted figure a guardian for her passage through the underworld. The artists who created these masterpieces worked by flickering flame, their brushes capturing not merely the likeness of their queen, but her very essence, believing that art itself possessed the power to grant immortality. The pigments they used were ground from precious stones and metals, creating colours so pure they seemed to glow with inner life even 4,000 years after their application. The mummification process that preserved these royal women was itself an act of profound devotion, taking 70 days of careful preparation and ritual. Master embalmers wrapped their bodies in linen strips soaked in resins brought from distant lands, placing amulets of gold and precious stones between the layers to protect them on their journey through the Duat. Their hearts, believed to be the seat of intelligence and emotion, were left within their bodies, for they would need them when Osiris weighed their deeds against the feather of Ma'at in the final judgment. Beyond the physical realm of tombs and mummies, these queens achieved a different kind of immortality through the monuments they commissioned and the changes they wrought upon Egyptian society. Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari continues to rise in elegant terraces against the Theban cliffs, its colonnades creating shadows that dance with the movement of the sun across the desert sky. The frankincense trees she brought back from Punt still grow in distant lands, their aromatic resin connecting the modern world to her ancient expeditions. The influence of these remarkable women rippled forward through subsequent dynasties like stones cast into still water. Later queens would study the precedents set by Hatshepsut's assumption of full pharaonic power, learning from her use of religious symbolism and architectural propaganda. Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemaic rulers, deliberately evoked the memory of earlier Egyptian queens in her royal imagery, understanding that her claim to legitimacy rested not only on her Greek ancestry, but on her connection to the profound tradition of feminine power that had shaped Egypt for millennia. Their stories became woven into the very fabric of Egyptian memory, passed down through generations of priests and scribes who understood that these women had been more than mere consorts or mothers of kings. They had been incarnations of divine feminine power, earthly representatives of goddesses like Isis and Hathor, who governed love, magic, and the protection of the vulnerable. The temples they built became places of pilgrimage where women would come to pray for similar strength and wisdom, their whispered petitions adding new layers of meaning to already sacred spaces. The rediscovery of these queens by modern archaeologists has revealed the sophisticated ways in which they manipulated symbols and imagery to project authority. Analysis of their portraits shows how they balanced traditional feminine attributes with the regalia of kingship, creating visual languages that spoke to different audiences simultaneously. Their crowns combined the uraeus serpent of divine protection with symbols traditionally associated with motherhood and fertility, demonstrating their understanding that true power often lies in synthesis rather than domination. The treasures found in their tombs speak of international connections that stretched from Nubia to Mesopotamia, revealing how these queens served as diplomatic bridges between Egypt and foreign lands. Golden jewelry bearing their cartouches has been discovered in distant kingdoms, evidence of gift exchanges that cemented alliances and extended Egyptian influence far beyond the traditional boundaries of the two lands. Their correspondence with foreign rulers, preserved on clay tablets and papyrus fragments, reveals sophisticated negotiations conducted in multiple languages and scripts. The artistic innovations patronized by these queens influenced Egyptian aesthetics for centuries after their deaths. The naturalistic style introduced during Nefertiti's era, with its emphasis on individual character and emotional expression, can be traced through subsequent periods of Egyptian art. Workshops established under their patronage continued producing masterpieces long after their royal sponsors had joined their ancestors, their techniques and aesthetic preferences becoming part of Egypt's cultural inheritance. In the modern world, their images have taken on new meanings, appearing on museum walls and in popular culture as symbols of female empowerment and ancient wisdom. Yet these contemporary interpretations, however well-intentioned, can only capture fragments of their complete reality. The true measure of their influence lies not in modern appropriations of their imagery, but in the historical record of their actual achievements and the ways they expanded possibilities for women in positions of authority. The preservation of their mummies and monuments allows modern science to unlock secrets of their daily lives and deaths. CT scans reveal the diseases they suffered, the foods they ate, the jewelry they wore, even in death. Chemical analysis of their cosmetics and perfumes provides insights into ancient trade networks and manufacturing techniques. DNA studies have begun to untangle the complex family relationships that shaped royal succession, revealing how these women navigated the intricate politics of dynastic marriage and inheritance. Their temples continue to function as places of mystery and contemplation, their chambers filled with the sound of wind moving through ancient stone. The prayers carved into their walls remain as potent invocations, their hieroglyphic texts continuing to cast spells for protection and prosperity. Visitors walking through these sacred spaces often report a profound sense of presence, as though the queens themselves still inhabit these carefully crafted environments designed to serve them throughout eternity. As the sun sets over the monuments they created and the tombs that preserve their earthly remains, the eternal influence of Egypt's queens becomes most apparent in the quiet moments between day and night. Their stories merge with the whispered legends of the desert wind, their achievements becoming part of the eternal rhythm of the Nile and the endless procession of stars across the Egyptian sky. In this timeless landscape, their reign continues, unmarked by the boundaries that separate the living from the dead, their power flowing as endlessly as the great river that gave birth to their magnificent civilization.